16. And then the usual benediction verses follow. So one could say the Dharma Chakra Pravartana Sutra is framed, surrounded by 100 verses from Ashwagosha. A whole chapter of the Buddha Charita and a large part of a chapter in the Soundarananda. And it's extremely fitting. Chapter 15 of the Buddha Charita, so the first part, is a poetical adaptation of the Dhammachakra Pravartana Sutta, though they are immediately related. It's the Dhammachakra Pravartana Sutta in poetry. And the Canto 16 of the Soundarananda is equally well related. It's devoted basically to the same topic, an exposition of the four noble truths. So this is the content of the Dhammachakra Pravartana Sutta. And so both quotations from Ashwagosha fit very well, support the canonical quotation, the sutra text, and it's the sutra text embedded or framed, as it were, by these texts. So here the connection is very clear and very easy to see between the verses and the sutra text. This is not always as clear in all the other cases, but that's the most, striking example of Ashwagosha's verses in the Tridhandakamala. And in one chapter, we have nearly 100 verses. Yeah? I can only repeat that. And so if Johnston would have access to this chapter, he would have had a totally different opinion, not on the authorship. We will come back to the question of authorship. It's since Ashwagosha did not compose the Dhammachakra Pravartana Sutta, this is Buddha's word, this is canonical. So only parts of the Tridhandamala, but significant parts, are from the pen of Ashwagosha as far as we can say today. So the Johnstons decided no would have to be, modified. Partly no and partly a decided yes. The Tridhandakamala contains both. A lot of Ashwagosha and a lot of from other sources, but, and we will come to that, and this is already preparing the next step today. Ashwagosha is the most prominent source as far as we can say at the moment for quotations. Or let me be more academic, more scholarly. Works connected with the name of Ashwagosha, which were in the view of the tradition, somehow or other connected with Ashwagosha, they are made use of by the compilers of the Tridhandakamala. They are preferred by the compilers of the Tridhandakamala, whoever these people were. And during the break, we very briefly addressed the question of origin of the Tridhandakamala. And Professor Bohulka asked if there was a Tibetan translation. No, we have only the Sanskrit manuscript, no translation in any language. And the Sanskrit manuscript is from the 11th century. So what does it tell us about the age of the text? When was the text composed? It's impossible to say, but it serves a ritual function. We will come back to that later. And this ritual function is described in the Vinaya of the Mula Savastivadins. So the idea of such rituals is much older than the manuscript of the 11th century. So it could have been compiled any time between the 5th and the 10th century. We have no idea, we have no possibility to say that. But it's surely older than the manuscript we have.
May I ask a question?
Of course, please, by all means. Sorry, just a second, Professor Deokar. I want to, I've completely forgot, I wanted to say in the beginning, if I'm incomprehensible or if I'm too short, please do not hesitate. The people here in the room, it's very easy to raise your hands. And the people in the online, they have to get, Talat is taking care of that. Looking for it, and you raise your online hand to ask a question. Again, now please.
Yeah, no, my question is like when they are giving the quotations from different texts in the Tridandamala, is it kind of mentioned with the name or the author, or they just come without any signal?
Excellent. Excellent question. And again, I have to ask for Björn's, I have to ask for your excuse that I didn't mention it. This is a very important point. Thank you. Really, thank you for addressing it. It's so clear to me, and it's always, you always forget things which are clear to you, but not at all clear to others. There is not a single reference in the whole, and I should tell you something about the size. Not a single reference in the whole text to any source, canonical or non-canonical. So to give you an idea of the size, you heard it's 115 folios, but that doesn't mean so much. It's 40 sutras, mostly sutras, shorter sutras. No, not a single sutra from the Diga Nikaya or Dirk Agama in Sanskrit, yeah, because they are simply too long. They are not, they don't work for ritual purposes. But sutras from the Samyuktagama, it's quite clear. Surely sutras from the Ekottarikagama, but this is not preserved in Sanskrit and also not preserved in a Chinese translation, the Ekottarikagama of the Mulasavasivadins. So from these collections which contain shorter sutras, which are good to use in a ritual connection. And besides these 40 sutras, around 1,500 verses, 1,500 stanzas. So we cannot give a precise figure because we cannot read every part. Yeah? But 1,500 verses, this is quite a lot. And not in a single case, the source of a verse is given, which is, of course, a great pity. And I'm inclined to scold the authors or compilers for not giving us this information. It's as I said before, when I found the first verse of the Buddha Charita, it's often sheer luck that you remember something. I remembered having read the contents before and searched for possible sources and looked in Johnston's English. This very nice. Johnston translated the second part of the Buddha Charita from the Tibetan into English. And I must say, I really respect this scholar. And the Tibetan quite often is difficult, but he made a very good job. Sometimes he adds Sanskrit terms. And I'm surprised how often he guessed the right term, which is not like Chö Dharma. This is easy, everybody could guess it, but guess equations which are unusual. So Johnston was I really have to, I'm an admirer of him, of his knowledge of Sanskrit and also Tibetan. So we have this very useful translation, which a fool like me reads much quicker than the Tibetan text. So I looked into the translation and, this sounds similar. let's look closer. And then I looked into the Tibetan, and then I saw, of course, immediately this is identical. And so many of our hits are luck, and many of our hits, and I will tell you much more. The time is to look at my. Sorry, we still have some time. There are so many lucky coincidences, and most of them, and this is another occasion for gratitude to all these people who put Sanskrit texts into digital versions and made them available on the internet. A very great source, all of you, I guess, know it, for Buddhist text is Gretil at the Göttingen University Library, which is simply wonderful. Yeah? And so I have my own sources. I have a lot of sources which are not in the public domain. And so this, it would be impossible. I must tell you that. So what most of the single verses we found due to this electronic to search in parallel texts available in electronic format. And this, I will come back to that quite soon, I think. So by now we have an amazing number of parallels, and parallels not only in Buddhist Sanskrit literature. I can give you a reference from Tantra Kaika, Panchatantra. Works like that. Yeah? From Brahmanical sources. And we will come to that, maybe not today, but next time, surely next time. So these verses, or some of the verses, they must derive from a common pool where Buddhist and non-Buddhist authors, which Buddhist and non-Buddhist authors knew and made use of for underlining their ideas. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to explain, because the compiler of the Panchatantra, I'm sure he didn't have the Tridanda in front of him. But he had some other source, probably not a Buddhist source, but this other source had a Buddhist source. Yeah? And so this is what I called intertextuality. The intertextuality of the Tridanda Kamala, of the, not the text, but of the source of its sources, is amazing. Throughout Indian literature, in a way, even in Jaina sources, you can find quotations. All these quotations are anonymous, of course. It's the same as in the Tridanda Kamala. You never get a reference. But with the help of electronic devices, you find them. And that's very good. And I wanted to make another point. Sorry, now it slipped me. Parallels. Exactly, yeah, sorry. If you remember the title of my class, there were two texts mentioned. One is the Tridanda Mala, or Tridanda Kamala, and the other Sutra Alankara. And this is a much disputed work. There is the idea that Ashwagosha composed a Sutra Alankara. And this has been discussed a lot. We will come back to that. Discussed a lot about 100 years ago. And the question, again, like in the case of the Tridanda Kamala, the question was answered in a negative way. And this time it was a German scholar who discussed with a famous French scholar, Sylvain Lévy, and Heinrich Lüders, the German. And they, for many years, they have hotly debated the question of the existence of such a sutra Alankara or not. And finally, the answer was reached. There is no. There never was such a sutra Alankara, most likely. But this has changed. And this is the time to mention the work of Professor Mahesh Deokar. Because, yeah, it is very important. I found a quotation even in the Kamadenu, Kavi Kamadenu, the commentary on the Amarakosha, Buddhist commentary, most likely, right? So it contains a quotation which it says Sutra, not Sutra Padesha Alankara. Exactly, and of course we find the verse in the Tridandamala. So what does it tell us? We will come back to that, because there are a few more, very few, but some indications which point. So these are all new developments, yeah. So it's only a few years that Lata presented her edition of this very wonderful, important text. So these are new sources, and they force us to readdress the question of a Sutra Alankara. This could be, and Kazunobu Matsuda, he's very much in favor of this, of the existence of a Sutra Alankara composed by Ashwagosha. And more I'm inclined to follow him. In the beginning, I was, how to say, influenced by Heinrich Lüders, famous German scholar. So who dares to speak against Heinrich Lüders? Nobody in Germany, but it may be necessary to do that in the light of new sources. What you always need is a game changer. I call it a game changer. A game changer in our case, in the case of philology, is a new text. So the Tridandaka is such a game changer, and the quotations we find, for instance, in the Kavi Kamadeno, they also bring such new aspects which force us to rethink previous conceived ideas, previous conceived truths. There is never truth in our field. Always, we have always to question it. So, yes, please. Yes, please.
Regarding the quotations from other texts, is it quite common for Buddhists not to mention the source?
Yes, I'm afraid yes. You find both, but yeah.
I'm reminded of another text which exists only in Tibetan.
Wait just a second. The audience, the online audience, will not hear you. So the question of Professor Bahulkar was, is it common in Buddhist texts not to mention the source of a quotation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I am reminded of another text of Prajnadanda ascribed to Nagarjuna, which exists only in Tibetan. But it's a kind of anthology. It's full of Sanskrit articles, well-known articles. But surprisingly, the author of Prajnadanda modifies them so as to suit the Buddhist doctrine.
So Professor Bahulkar gives the example of the Prajnadanda, a work ascribed in the Buddhist tradition to Nagarjuna, famous author, and preserved only in Tibetan translation. But many of it's a collection of Subhashita, one could say, right? Gnomic verses. And you find, not all of them, I think, but a number of them also in Sanskrit, right? But sometimes in the Tibetan translation, slightly modified. So to adapt, possibly to be adapted to a Buddhist background, to connect with the Tridanda Kamala, we find a number of verses in Subhashita collections. Yeah? So again, but and there are, I would call that variant readings. In one case, we will discuss that next time, perhaps. We will have a verse where the Brahmanical source uses another word, metrically is the same, but another word for, and I think they do it intentionally to fit the content. Yeah? But again, so Subhashita collections are something we try to check when we look at the verses in the Tridana Kamala. And to come back to my next point, the Tridana Kamala seems to contain, to a large degree, verses which by the tradition, in the Buddhist tradition, come from works connected with the name of Ashwagosha. So we never know for sure. So Pranya Danda, was it really authored by the great Nagarjuna? We will never know. And it's quite likely that this is just a name, a label put on the text. So Ashwagosha may also be such a label. And we will now turn to a text. And I introduce it with the question, we have 350 verses from Buddha Charita and Soundarananda. Is there more which you could connect with the name of Ashwagosha? And indeed there is. In the Tantra, Tantra section that is in one of the two parts of the Tibetan Buddhist canon, there's a work preserved with the Tibetan title Nyangen Selva, and in the colophon it's called Shokka Vinodana. So this is quite the same. Yeah? The Tibetan title is a very nice, very fitting, exact translation of Shokka Vinodana. Both mean the same, consolation of grief, dispelling of grief. And the colophon gives Ashwagosha as the author. In the Tibetan colophon says Lopen Tayang. So teacher Ashwagosha, Acharya Ashwagosha, as the author, and lists the Indian Upadhyaya Ajita Shribhadra and the Tibetan Shakya as translators and revisers of the Tibetan translation. And if these names are correct, the translation may stem from the 11th century. So it's a late, what we would call a late translation into Tibetan, not one of the early of the empire time. And this makes it difficult, of course, to speculate about the author. The work consists of 40 Tibetan shlokas, and it deals with a topic we touched already today, the inevitability of human death, which is illustrated with a number of interesting examples and comparisons. To my knowledge, in the academic world, this work seems to have gone unnoticed so far. I know no study, no translation, no nothing of this little work, although it's ascribed to Ashwagosha. And a while ago, I mentioned the name Peter Daniel Sancto, our Hungarian friend and colleague. And I said that he is studying a second manuscript without title. He calls it Sadharma Parikatha, studying and eventually editing this second manuscript. And this is also divided into chapters, and chapter 11 of this Sadharma Parikatha contains or deals with the subject of Shokka Vinodana. So Santo started to look around. He started to look into the Tridandaka Mala, and he found in the Tridandaka Mala 40 verses which, on closer inspection, are the Shoka Vinodana, ascribed in the Tibetan translation to Ashwagosha. Twice 20 stanzas, the first 20 before the sutra, the next 20 after the sutra. Exactly. So they are not only preserved in a Tibetan, the Shoka Vinodana, it's not only preserved in a Tibetan translation, but now we have the full Sanskrit text in the Tridandamala. And with the help, and now this shows you this how the work goes on, the intertextuality and how we find sources. I have digital version of the Central Asian Sanskrit manuscripts, and I searched there, and I found manuscript fragments from a manuscript in Central Asia, which evidently contained the full Shoka Vinodana. How can I say that it contains the full text? Sanskrit texts in metrical texts in